Empower the use of open source with software composition analysis from Revenera.
Hello, I'm Kendra Morton, Product Marketing Manager at Revenera. Welcome to another Software Composition Analysis podcast. We've got an interesting topic for you today, and my guest is a familiar voice, Venkat Ramdanga, Principal Product Manager at Revenera. Hey there, Venkat.
Hey, Kendra. Thanks for having me here. I heard a lot about these SEA podcasts, and I'm glad to be on one of these. Thank you. Looking forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, great. I'm glad to have you here, Venkat. So today's discussion revolves around the need for users of open source to provide the right level of author attribution. Organizations today have to take into account the amount of open source software they utilize in applications in order to develop, let's say, an effective strategy for maintaining the compliance and security of the software supply chain. In many cases, it comprises upwards of 70, even over 90% of the code, depending on which study that you look at. But regardless, it's substantial. When open source components are used, that code is authored by someone who licenses the use of the code to others. As many of you are most likely aware, licenses vary, and so do the legal obligations of the user. Attribution for the author is one of those necessary obligations. So, Venkat, that's what we're here to talk about today. How important is attribution when it comes to fulfilling license obligations?
Sure. So obligations is one of the favorite topics of anybody who is working on the OSS world, right? And so is attribution, right? So I mean, let's start with defining what an attribution actually means in the open source world, right? So if you talk about in plain English, okay, it's just referring to the original author when the author's work is reused, right? So let's try to simplify that further by taking an example of a movie. Okay, so if I am making a movie, okay, and I wish to use a snippet of a popular song in my movie, right? So since I have used someone else's work, okay, giving credit to that person is totally respectful, right? And it becomes an obligation if the music I'm using from that other composer or singer, okay, is only available in the commercial platform, unless I'm using the national anthem or some other common folk music, right? But sometimes I'd have to probably pay royalty for its use, right? But most of the times I'd have to just mention the original composer in my movie credits, right? So this is not just being respectful for others' creativity, but it's also an acknowledgement that the work in my movie is not completely original. So there is pieces of items in my movie which does not completely belong to me, but I'm reusing someone else's creativity or work. Okay, but at the same time, I want to give them enough credit by mentioning them in my movie credits or saying thank you. Okay, at the end of the movie, right? So now that we have a very popular analogy, let's try to apply that to software, right? So when you're building your own software, a similar need arises, right? So when you're using an open source component, it's very important to understand the license in which the original work was produced, right? So it's not just the license of your own software, whether you're an open source developer or you're a commercial software vendor, it doesn't matter, right? So when you're developing when you're reusing an open source component, okay, you need to understand the license in which the original work was produced, right? And when releasing your content, okay, that now includes the open source code, okay, you have an obligation. Okay, so a simple obligation could be, hey, give me attribution to the original author, right? Now, similar to movie credits, if you look at compare the movie credits to this, okay, you acknowledge that okay, there is a piece of work in my software that is not my original idea. Okay, so though I'm making money from it by selling my own software to my customers, okay, but I'm acknowledging that I have actually used someone else's work, okay, when I released my software as a part, okay, by declaring that work, okay, in what we call as third party notices, right? So attribution is really really important because it gives credibility to you and your software, okay, by acknowledging that okay, you had some reuse that you have done, and gives a lot of respect in among your peers, and your customers or users are happy, and the original or open source software author is also pretty happy because you're respecting all the obligations that the author has mentioned in their license agreement. Right. So, because it's not just that you acknowledge using the software, but you're publicly obliging to all of the conditions. For example, some open source software may say, "Hey, don't modify my software. Use it as it is." Right? And some may say, "You can use however you want, but just mention my name." Right? So you're not just obliging to all the conditions that come with the open source software, but are also building a good reputation for yourself by meeting these obligations.
Yeah, I love the analogy. Very well done. It kind of helps it to really make sense, right? And makes it somewhat obvious, and maybe that people don't really realize that. So, talk to me about the difficulty or the process of providing attribution. How is that done, and how often?
Yeah, so I mean, I hate this response of saying it depends, right? But let me clarify that with an easy example. So when you know for sure that your software has some open source code that's completely original on its own, right? So your software is original, and then the open source code that I use is also purely original. Okay, that is not inheriting somewhere something else, right? It becomes very easy to give just credit to person A whose component I'm actually using. That is the most straightforward example. But all of us understand that it is never as simple as that, right? It becomes very tricky to actually find a trail, right? So this is a typical supply chain problem we see in the open source world. As a software vendor, okay, you are not just responsible for the software that you are producing, right? But you're also responsible for the components that made its way into your software via some other means, right? So that means could be the open source software trail, right? Meaning A has B and B has C. I am using A, but and A has actually B and B has C. Now you know that you're only using A, but you may not be even using the subcomponent called B, right? So this goes back to my favorite example. When I explain open source to anybody who doesn't understand composition analysis. I say, if you're Burger King, okay, and you're trying to get the bread sourced from another vendor, okay, and if your customer complains that the bread is stale, you can't just say, "Hey, you know what, it's not my problem, my vendor is producing this stale bread," right? Because you are responsible as Burger King for everything, right? So though you don't manufacture it yourself, right? So if you apply the same analogy back to software, the tricky part is finding out that you have B in your software, okay, and B is coming from C or whatever, right? So though you're not actually using it, and then the regular nightmare of finding the right license for that component. So you have to do these steps to say, first identify that I have B in my software, okay, and then figure out, okay, B is having its own license as declared by the original author. Though I have no intentions, though my code is actually not calling B and whatnot, but I am eventually responsible for having the open source component B, okay, as a part of my product. And this process has to be repeated. And to your question, how often should we do it, right? So every time I release, modern software, sometimes it just gets released multiple times in a day, right? And every time I, do a release, this process has to be rinsed and repeated every single time, I release and host my software or release my software, right? Now, how do you provide this? How do you actually go about doing the attribution? We for several years there's a practice in the open source world where we say, I want to compile a document called third party notices document for the software. So in simple words, it will be as simple as saying, okay, it's your movie credits that you see at your end, right, at the movie end, right? So whose work is what component. So that is simply third party notices, right? So though compiling the doc itself is insanely difficult, okay, you cannot run away from that trail. Okay, you have to establish the trail. Okay, only then you can compile your third party notices document so that you fulfill your obligation of attributing to the original author.
So we talked a lot in this podcast for SCA about the software supply chain, and that again is an example of the complexity of the software supply chain, understanding your software supply chain, and then and to add to that complexity, just those legal obligations that you have to be aware of. So again, yeah, that's great, great discussion. So we also hear a lot about the software bill of materials these days for very good reasons, right? But how do the two differ? What's the difference between a software bill of materials and providing third party attribution notices?
Yeah. So software bill of materials was, coined, really a long time back, but it became popular only after the executive order, as we all know, right? And there is a common tendency to, get mistaken for, the software bill of materials, which is often called as BOM, okay, to the third party notices. They're technically different documents. As BOM, okay, is just a compilation of all the parts of my software. Okay, I mean, don't get trivial, don't think this is a trivial process. This is also a cumbersome process. But as BOM is just a compilation of all the parts of my software. They need not necessarily be limited to open source. So you can list on OSS components, which is open source software components, as well as, okay, I have to list on my commercial components. Because the whole need of SBOM is that you form an entire audit trail of your software and what is it including, whether it is very popular work from an open source developer, or whether it is commercial work coming from let's say, for example, Oracle or Microsoft with respect to Java or .NET or any other runtime that are actually including as part of your uh, software, right? So it could be a UI kit, for all you can say, and I'm using EXTJS as a UI kit, okay, for my commercial application, right? So should I include EXTJS as a part of my SBOM? Absolutely yes, because that is also one of the part that has made it into my eventual software. So compared to this, okay, an attribution document or a third-party notices document, it will consist of the licenses. So if I'm using, let's say, if I am A and I'm actually using B and B is actually using C, right? So, my attribution document will contain the the license agreement of, the B and C as a part of the document, right? And this third party notices document is something that I have to be either shipping or, host somewhere for my users to be accessible. Right? So this is where I go ahead and start saying people that I am using some other open source software. At the same time, I am actually obliging to their needs, right? So it's very important that I provide the original license as declared by the author, right? Like for example, if I'm using a component called B, and the B is declared as an MIT license, I cannot just go to standard MIT portal and then standard spdx.org and find out MIT license and then take an extract and put it in my notices document. No, right? So the original author would have written their own, conditions. Somebody would have said, "Hey, this software comes as is." Somebody would have said, "Hey, this software comes as is, but if you want certain, enhancements and whatnot, here is some URLs where you can actually find posts to, get the issues resolved, or you can, do your own enhancements to it, right?" So when you're compiling a third-party notices document, it is very critical for you to declare, the original license declared by the author, not just the standard template license.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. So we don't typically tout our own capabilities in our podcasts, right? But in this case, given there are very few solutions on the market that can provide organizations with this ability to fulfill this particular legal obligation and do it essentially with the click of a button. So we're going to take a moment here to talk about Code Insight, which is, in full disclosure, our solution. How does Code Insight deliver on third-party attribution notices?
Sure, Kendra. So we talked about the importance of providing the original license text by the author, because this is very critical, because some of the notices, they differ from one component to the other, or they differ from the standard license in just the copyright statement. So my notice could just be copyright Venkat and then followed by standard text, which is coming from MIT's standard text, right? So that small text of copyright Venkat is so critical for attribution, because if somebody is using my piece of software, okay, they're actually acknowledging that this piece of software is owned and originally developed by Venkat, right? So that text of including my copyright in the notices text is pretty critical, and this is where Code Insight shines, right? And it is extremely difficult because the open source authors keep releasing the software under different licenses in many releases, right? So my copyright statement at the time of when the software has been included in the commercial software would have been copyright Venkat 2005, and today I could have been copyright I would have changed my copyright student for right. I would have said copyright Venkat Ramdonga in 2022, right. So it's extremely important that I include copyright Venkat 2005 and the text that I have included back in 2005 when I released my open source component, right. And the key to successful notices document is finding these original text. It's not very simple, right? Because this text is actually in the original source code, and they're not available as a part of the source or the release software in the form of a license text. Right, because when you're using an open source component, you may or may not run into this license file. Like for instance, you might just be using a DLL to include a particular method from the OSS author. Right. So when you scan your software's source or binaries, you will definitely run into the DLL, but the chances of running into the original license file is pretty bleak, right? So you understand the problem now, right? So when I only have the DLL and the DLL doesn't have the license text, for all I can say, if this DLL is this, it is declared under MIT license. That's a trivial part, but what is the actual MIT license, right? So in order to get the true license text, what you need to do is you need to figure out the component, you need to figure out the version, go to the repository, download the right license, scrape through the docs, for the license text, and then copy paste that text into your notices text.
Very
Right?
manual, right?
Yeah, right. It's purely manual and it's
Hmm.
extremely cumbersome. Okay, talk to any open source analyst. I think they will tell you how painful this process is,
Yeah.
right? Including our own Alex.
Yes.
Right? So,
Absolutely.
here's where polling site actually helps you. What we have done in the last several months is that we've been collecting these license texts from all of these open source repositories as declared by the original author, right? So we have amassed a huge number of license texts that are available in the source code then when they were released by the author, right? So by knowing the OSS component name and version, we will be able to now retrieve the license text, in the most common cases, and reduce the work for you. Otherwise, this following the trail of component version or repo, the release, and then trying to find the right license, right file with the license text, and then copy pasting them and putting them in notice, and then generating a report. All of this is a pretty cumbersome process. So we have now exposed these, ability to retrieve these license texts using simple APIs, and we also have an out of the box report which will not just extract the text for you, it will also make a report for you which is properly formatted, and compile a third party notices report for you.
Very good, very good. So, just a huge important discussion. I often wonder, how many people out there, how many organizations or engineering teams are actually, having to your point, do this the manual way. And a better way is to automate that, and to automate that with a push button. So, thank you. It's a great discussion, Venkat, and important. So, thank you for spending time with me today.
Sure, Kendra. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here and talking about the attribution.
Yeah, yeah. So, to those who have listened to this podcast, if you would like to learn more about third party attribution notices, we have a data sheet in our resources section on revenera.com. You can check that out. Just look for it. If you would like to get a demo of Code Insight, and particularly this whole idea of providing and need to provide third party attribution notices, or if you have more questions, you can reach out to myself, Ke Morton at revenera.com. Venkat as well, I'm sure would love to talk with you or take your questions. He is vdonga at revenera.com, or you can select the contact us link on our website, and that'll get you to someone that you can have a discussion with. So again, thank you for joining us today. For sure, we'll be back soon to talk about another interesting topic in the world of open source and software supply chain management. So have a fantastic day.
Empower the use of open source with software composition analysis from Revenera.